Some talents bloom only in darkness. Some gifts grow stronger under restraint. And some minds chart entire worlds while confined to a single room. This is the story of one such mind. It's a story murmured through the halls of military academies, argued over by historians, and quietly scrubbed from official records. What you're about to hear will sound implausible, yet every detail has been painstakingly pieced together from letters, journals, and sworn testimonies that survived fires, wars, and deliberate attempts at erasure. By the end, the question won't be whether this happened, but why no one wants you to know it did. The plantation ledgers of Hacienda San Rafael in colonial Peru record him only as Mateo. Field laborer, age uncertain. Property acquired, 1781. No surname, no birthplace, no history worth preserving. He was about 9 years old when Don Hernand Villagretildo ! Minor landowner drowning in major debts purchased him at a Lima auction house, bundled alongside 3 mules and a shipment of iron tools. Mateo was undersized for his age, his hands already roughened by work no child should ever endure. But it was his eyes that drew uneasy glances, an intensity the auctioneer hadn't mentioned, as though the boy was constantly measuring distances invisible to everyone else. The hacienda lay in a valley where 3 rivers converged, forming a shifting labyrinth of waterways that rearranged themselves with every rainy season. Cargo had a habit of disappearing there. Messengers routinely lost their way. Even seasoned mule drivers sometimes took 3 days to complete routes that should have required only 1. Neighbors joked that the valley itself was cursed with confusion. Mateo spent his first months in near total silence. He hauled water, tended animals, and slept in crowded quarters with 24 other enslaved workers. Yet the overseers began to notice something unsettling. Whenever Mateo was sent on an errand, or even to places he had never been, he never got lost. Not once. At first, they attributed it to luck, then a test. One morning, the head overseer, a Portuguese man named Thiago, deliberately gave Mateo contradictory directions to a storage shed on the property's eastern boundary. He told the boy to go north past the crooked pine, then east at the stone wall, then south along the creek, a route that would lead him in circles. Mateo listened carefully, nodded, and walked away. He returned in half the expected time, having gone directly to the shed by a path Thiago didn't even realize existed. When questioned, the boy said simply, the sun was there, pointing, so east had to be there. The shed was east. I went east. Thiago laughed it off, but he mentioned it to Don Hernand during their weekly accounting. Don Hernand was drowning in debt. His coffee crops had failed 2 seasons running. His silver mining venture had collapsed when the tunnel flooded. Creditors circled like vultures. He needed a miracle, or at minimum a profitable distraction. That distraction arrived in the form of General Don Sebastian Alvarez, a Spanish military officer stationed in Lima, who'd heard rumors of excellent hunting in the San Rafael Valley. The general came with an entourage, 3 junior officers, a mapmaker named Felipe, servants, guards, and enough baggage to supply a small expedition. Don Hernand saw opportunity. He opened his home, served his finest wine, organized hunts he could barely afford. If he could curry favor with the general, perhaps stores in Lima would open, perhaps loans would materialize. On the 3rd day of the visit, the hunting party got catastrophically lost. They'd ventured into the hill country east of the Hacienda, tracking deer. Felipe, the military mapmaker, had charted their route carefully on parchment, marking landmarks and compass bearings. But the valleys all looked identical. Same vegetation, same rock formations, same winding creeks. By late afternoon, Felipe's map had led them in a complete circle back to their starting point. The general's mood darkened. The junior officers exchanged nervous glances. Don Hernand felt his opportunity slipping away with every wrong turn. Then someone remembered. The landowner has a slave boy who never gets lost. They sent for Mateo. The boy arrived barefoot and silent before a group of mounted officers in polished boots and military brass. The general barely glanced at him. They say you know these hills, the general said, not as a question. Mateo nodded. "Can you lead us back to the hacienda?" The boy looked at the sky, at the shadows on the ground, at the angle of light filtering through the canopy. Then he pointed that way. 2 hours if we don't stop. Felipe the mapmaker scoffed. "That's northwest. The hacienda is southeast from here." The boy's guessing. But Don Nan, desperate, overruled him. "Let the boy lead." Mateo led them home in 90 minutes, taking shortcuts the officers would never have found. Reading the landscape like text on a page, he noted where moss grew thickest on trees indicating north. He observed the direction water flowed in tiny streams. He measured distances with his eyes in a way that seemed almost supernatural, but wasn't. It was simply observation so acute it appeared magical to those who'd never needed to develop it. The general arrived at the hacienda impressed and curious. Over dinner he asked Don Hernand about the boy. "Can he read?" "No, General. He's never been taught." "Can he do mathematics?" "I wouldn't know." The general sat back in his chair, fingers drumming on the table. "I wonder what he could do with proper tools." What began as idle curiosity became an experiment that would alter several lives irrevocably. General Alvarez decided to extend his stay. He had Felipe bring Mateo to the hacienda's library, a dusty room Donan rarely used, and spread a military map across the table. It showed the region around Lima with mountains, rivers, roads, and settlements marked in careful detail. "Tell me what you see," the general said. Mateo stared at the map for a long moment. His finger traced the blue lines representing rivers. "Water flows down," he said quietly. "These lines, they're rivers." "Yes." The boy's eyes lit with understanding. His finger moved to the concentric circles marking elevation. "And these are hills, mountains." "Correct." For the next hour, Felipe watched in astonishment as Mateo decoded the map's symbolic language through pure logic and observation. The boy had never seen a map before, yet he grasped its principles faster than cadets who'd studied for months. The general saw potential. He saw a tool. Over the following weeks, an arrangement took shape. Don Hernand, eager to maintain the general's goodwill, and seeing no value in a slave's unusual skill, agreed to lend Mateo to the military. The boy would be taken to Lima to the general's residence, where he would assist with cartographic work. It was temporary, the general assured, a few months at most. Mateo was 12 years old when they took him from the only home he'd known. He never saw the hacienda again. In Lima, Mateo entered a world of maps. The general's residence included a dedicated cartography room where military campaigns were planned, territorial surveys compiled, and strategic routes plotted. Felipe worked there alongside 2 other military map makers, preparing charts for Spain's colonial operations across South America. Mateo's initial role was menial, cleaning inkwells, preparing parchment, organizing reference materials. But he watched, he absorbed, and when Felipe noticed the boy studying a half-finished map of the Andes mountain passes, he made a decision that would haunt him later. He began teaching Mateo properly. It started with basic concepts, scale, orientation, symbols. But Mateo's progress was explosive. Within 3 months, he could interpret complex topographical surveys. Within 6, he was spotting errors in maps drawn by trained professionals. Within a year, he was solving problems that stumped the military's official cartographers. The general recognized what he had. Mateo became an unofficial member of the mapping team. Unofficial because acknowledging a slave's intellectual contribution would undermine the entire social order that sustained colonial power. Here's how it worked. Officers would present mapping challenges to Felipe's team. Felipe would discreetly show the materials to Mateo. Mateo would provide solutions. Felipe would present those solutions as his own work. The general would praise Felipe's brilliance. Everyone benefited. Everyone except Mateo. The boy worked in a windowless back room surrounded by maps of places he would never visit, solving geographical puzzles that would guide military campaigns he would never participate in. His recommendations influenced troop movements, supply routes, and strategic planning across the viceroyalty. He was 13 years old and already shaping colonial warfare. But there were rules, strict, unbreakable rules. Matteo could study maps under supervision. He could draw on practice parchment. He could discuss cartographic theory with Philippe in private, but he was never allowed to keep maps overnight, never allowed to carry them outside the graphy room, and most peculiarly, never allowed to hold a compass. This last rule came directly from General Alvarez. A compass grants autonomy, the general explained to Felipe during one of their evening consultations. A slave with map-reading skills and a compass could navigate anywhere, could escape to territories beyond our reach. We benefit from his mind, but we must never give him the means to use it independently. So, Matteo learned to work without the fundamental tool of his craft. He memorized magnetic declinations. He calculated bearings mentally. He oriented maps using only the position of the sun, the time of day, and mathematical reasoning. He became exceptional at navigation precisely because he was denied its most basic instrument. By 1789, Matteo was 17. His reputation, carefully attributed to Felipe and the mapping team, had grown within military circles. The Viceroyalty of Peru faced increasing logistical challenges, indigenous resistance in remote regions, difficult terrain hindering supply lines, inaccurate maps leading to failed expeditions. Then came the commission that would change everything. A Spanish military force was being assembled to establish a new outpost in the Amazonian foothills, a strategic location meant to secure territorial claims and suppress local resistance. The region was poorly mapped. Previous expeditions had lost men to disease, hostile encounters, and most frequently simply getting lost in the labyrinth of rivers, canyons, and dense forest. General Alvarez was tasked with creating reliable maps for the operation. The commission came from the Viceroy himself. Success would mean prestige and promotion. Failure would mean professional disgrace. The general summoned his team. He gave them 6 weeks to produce comprehensive maps of a region most considered unmappable. Felipe, now in his 40s and aware his actual skills fell short of his reputation, turned to Matteo. "Can it be done?" he asked the young man in the quiet of the cartography room. Matteo studied the fragmentary or contradictory existing maps of the region. Missionary report, indigenous testimonies collected by force, rough sketches from traders. He spread them across the worked, comparing, cross-referencing, identifying patterns. "The river system is the key," he said finally. "Everything connects to water. If we map the watersheds correctly, the rest follows." "Can you do it without surveying the territory yourself?" Matteo was quiet for a long moment. "I can create something better than what exists, but I'll need access to every recorded observation, every traveler's account, every missionary log. And I'll need time." They gave him 5 weeks. Felipe obtained every scrap of geographical information about the region from military archives, church records, and trading company files. Matteo worked 16-hour days synthesizing contradictory data, applying logical principles to resolve discrepancies, filling gaps with calculated projections based on geological patterns. He created a masterpiece. The map Matteo produced, credited of course to Felipe and the military graphy department, showed the Amazonian foothills with unprecedented accuracy. He deduced the locations of rapids, identified navigable channels, predicted seasonal flooding zones, and marked strategic high points for potential outposts, all without ever setting foot in the region. When the military expedition set out, they carried copies of Matteo's map. They returned 4 months later, having successfully established the outpost with minimal casualties. The expedition commander reported that the maps had been extraordinarily accurate, almost uncannily so. The Viceroy personally commended General Alvarez. Felipe received a promotion and salary increase. Don Hernand, still technically Matteo's owner, was paid a modest consulting fee. Matteo received nothing, not even acknowledgement. But something had shifted. The general began looking at the young man differently, with an unsettling mixture of pride and fear. Success bred demand. Officers who'd heard of the accurate maps requested Philippe's services. The general, now promoted to a senior administrative position, formalized the arrangement. Philippe's graphy department, which meant Matteo would serve the Viceroyalty's military operations exclusively. For Matteo, now 18, this meant even longer hours, even more complex challenges, even deeper isolation. He rarely left the graphy room. His world consisted of parchment, ink, second-hand observations, and mental calculations. While other slaves in Lima might at least walk through markets or see the ocean, Matteo saw only paper representations of places he could never visit. The irony was suffocating. He was creating the very maps that allowed others their freedom of movement while being denied movement himself. Felipe, to his credit, felt increasing guilt. He'd become wealthy and respected for work that wasn't truly his. Late at night, after wine, he would sometimes sit with Matteo and discuss graphy as equals, teacher and student becoming colleagues. "You could be the greatest mapmaker in the Americas," Felipe told him once, "if circumstances were different." "But they aren't," Matteo replied without bitterness. It was simply fact. During one of these conversations, Felipe made a dangerous offer. "I could teach you to use a compass." In secret, Matteo looked at him for a long time. The general would find out eventually, and then neither of us would be safe. "You deserve to at least hold one to understand the instrument completely." "I already understand it," Matteo said quietly. "I don't need to hold it to know how it works." But the truth was more complicated. Matteo desperately wanted to hold a compass, not for practical reasons. He'd learned to work around its absence, but for symbolic ones. A compass represented autonomy, agency, the power to determine one's own direction. Everything he didn't have. The prohibition had become a psychological cage more constraining than any physical chain. In 1792, during a brief period of diplomatic cooperation between Spain and Britain, a British naval officer named Captain Thomas Graves arrived in Lima to discuss maritime charts and coastal mapping. He was a Fellow of the Royal Society, educated at Oxford, and considered an expert in nautical navigation. General Alvarez, eager to demonstrate Spanish cartographic sophistication, invited Captain Graves to review some of the military's recent mapping work, specifically the Amazonian foothills maps that had proven so successful. Graves studied them with professional interest, then astonishment. "These watershed projections," he said, pointing to Matteo's work, "this is extraordinarily advanced theoretical graphy. The hydrological modeling alone would challenge our best men at the Admiralty who made these calculations." "Our cartography department," the general replied smoothly, led by Felipe Cortés. Graves requested a meeting with Felipe. The meeting was arranged in the graphy room. Felipe, nervous, tried to answer Graves' technical questions. He managed adequately on basic points but faltered on the theoretical foundations. The British captain's expression shifted from respect to confusion. "I don't mean to be indelicate," Graves said carefully, "but these maps suggest a level of theoretical understanding that seems inconsistent with your explanations." Felipe's face reamed. In the corner of the room, Matteo was organizing parchment, apparently paying no attention, but his hands had stopped moving. An uncomfortable silence stretched. The general, sensing exposure, intervened. "Captain Graves, our methods are perhaps different from British approaches. We value practical results over theoretical discourse." Graves wasn't fooled, but he was diplomatic enough not to press further in that moment. However, over the following days, he made discreet inquiries. He spoke with junior officers. He examined the workflow of the graphy department. He noted who spent the most time in the mapping room, who had ink-stained fingers, who understood the work's actual depth. He noticed Matteo. One afternoon, when Felipe was called away to a meeting, Graves found himself alone in the graphy room with the young slave. Matteo was working on coastal charts, cross-referencing tidal patterns with lunar cycles. "You're the one who made the Amazonian maps," Graves said quietly. "Not a question." Matteo's hand froze above the parchment. He didn't look up. "I'm just a copist, sir." "No, you're not." Graves moved closer. "Those watershed calculations require understanding of fluid dynamics, geological surveying, and predictive modeling. That's not copying. That's original cartographic theory." Matteo remained silent. "How old are you?" 19, I think. And you've never held a compass? Finally, Matto looked up. Never, sir. Graves reached into his coat and removed his personal compass, a beautiful brass instrument with glass face and carved wooden case. He set it on the table between them. Go ahead. Matteo stared at the compass like it might bite him. His hands trembled slightly. I'm not permitted. I'm giving you permission. With respect, Captain. It's not your permission to give. They stood in tense silence. Graves eventually pocketed the compass, his expression troubled. But before leaving, he said something that would plant a seed in Matto's mind. There are places in this world where a man is valued for his mind, not his legal status. England has freed slaves. So has France in their fashion. This system you're trapped in, it's not universal. It's not eternal. After Graves left, Matto returned to his charts. But his hands shook for hours afterward. The compass he'd been denied had suddenly become a symbol of an entirely different kind of freedom. Captain Graves departed Lima, but he'd left disruption in his wake. Felipe couldn't meet the Englishman's eyes after their uncomfortable meeting. The general became paranoid about operational security. And Matteo had started to dream differently, not of escape. The practical difficulties were immense, but of recognition, of agency, of a life where his work belonged to him. He began a secret project. Late at night, after the household slept, Matteo would take discarded parchment scraps, materials too damaged or stained for official use, and work by candlelight in his quarters. He was creating a personal map, not of military routes or colonial territories, but of the world, as he understood it from thousands of hours studying other people's geographical work. He'd never seen the ocean, yet he mapped coastlines from naval charts. He'd never crossed mountains, yet he drew the Andes with detailed precision from survey data. He'd never left Peru, yet he charted South America, the Caribbean, the Atlantic, crossing to Africa and Europe. It was his act of intellectual resistance, claiming ownership, however private, of knowledge they'd forced him to generate, but never allowed him to possess. The map was beautiful, meticulous. It incorporated corrections to official charts, filled gaps in existing knowledge, represented thousands of hours of accumulated expertise. He drew it in sections on separate small parchments that he could easily hide. He told no one, not Felipe, who might have been sympathetic, not the other slaves who wouldn't understand. The map was his alone. For nearly a year, Matto worked on his secret project. It grew more detailed, more comprehensive. He'd created what might have been the most accurate map of South America existing in 1793, and it was hidden under the floorboards of a slave quarter known to no one. Then Don Hernan sold him. Financial desperation has its own logic. Don Hernan's debts had finally consumed him. The hacienda would be seized by creditors. He needed to liquidate assets quickly, quietly before legal proceedings made it impossible. Matteo, despite the informal arrangement with General Alvarez, was still legally Don Hernan's property, and property could be sold. The buyer was a mining company operating in the northern highlands near Cajamarra. They needed laborers for dangerous work in silver mines. They paid immediately in hard currency, no questions asked. The general was calendars, real and approaching. But his health was failing. Years of accumulated damage, the Cajamarra mines, the plantation labor, the chronic stress of perpetual captivity had created cascading health problems. He developed a persistent cough that wouldn't resolve. His hands shook with tremors that made detailed cartographic work increasingly difficult. He lost weight. He couldn't afford to lose. The office physician examining him at Don Vicente's request was blunt. His body is breaking down. Lungs compromised, possibly tubercular nutrition effects, chronic exhaustion. He needs rest, better conditions, medical treatment beyond what I can provide. Can he continue working? For how long? 10 months. The physician hesitated. Possibly, but it's accelerating his decline. Don Vish faced an ethical dilemma. Matto's contracted freedom was approaching, but forcing him to continue working at full intensity might kill him before he reached that freedom. However, releasing him early required vice-regal approval, a bureaucratic process that could take months. He chose a compromise, reduced Matto's work hours, assigned him less physically demanding projects, provided better medical support. Matteo appreciated the gestures, but he understood the mathematics. His body was failing faster than the calendar moved toward freedom. He might not make it. Raphael, now Matteo's closest friend, visited him frequently during this period. They'd play chess, a game Matteo excelled at through the same spatial reasoning he applied to geography. They'd discuss geography, politics, philosophy within the careful boundaries of what a free man and slave could safely debate. One evening, Raphael asked, "What will you do after freedom?" Matteo had thought about little else. Create maps that are actually mine. Maybe teach, maybe work independently. You could apply to the Royal Society with your portfolio. I have no portfolio, Matteo interrupted quietly. Everything I created before this office belongs to others. My London maps are credited as GRA for unknown. I'd have to start over, proving myself with work I'm too sick to do. Then we document everything now. I'll testify to your abilities. Don Vicente will provide references. And who employs a freed slave for when they can hire a Spanish professional? Raphael had no answer. They both knew the reality. Matteo's freedom, if he survived to receive it, would likely mean freedom to starve as an unemployed freedman rather than as a productive slave. The system was designed to make freedom almost as cruel as captivity. In June 1800, with 4 months remaining until his manumission date, Matteo began his last official geography project, a comprehensive map of Lima's water supply system. The city's aqueducts, wells, and distribution networks were poorly documented. The Royal Cartography Office had been tasked with creating definitive maps to support urban planning. It was technical, unglamorous work, but important. Matteo threw himself into it with the obsessive focus he'd always applied to geography. Partly because it was his nature, partly because staying busy kept him from thinking about the cough that was getting worse. The weight he continued to lose, the exhaustion that never fully lifted. Raphael assisted him, handling the physical surveying work while Matteo focused on analysis and synthesis. They worked well together. The partnership Felipe and Matteo could never quite achieve because of guilt and exploitation. The map they created was like everything Matteo touched exceptional. It identified inefficiencies in the current water distribution, proposed improvements, flagged areas at risk during earthquakes. Municipal authorities praised it as exactly what the city needed. The cover documentation read, "Cartographic Survey by Matteo and Raphael Silla News, Royal Cartography Office, Lima, 1800. His name first. Properly credited on work that would be preserved in municipal archives. When they finished in September, Don Vish organized something unprecedented, a small ceremony within the office to acknowledge the work's completion. Minor officials attended. Wine was served. Matteo's contributions were publicly praised. It was the first time in his life anyone had celebrated his work. While he was in the room, Raphael gave a short speech about Matteo's expertise and dedication. Don Vish presented him with a bonus payment, real money, enough to mean something. And they gave him a gift, a high-quality compass in a carved wooden case with an inscription. To Matteo, navigator of spaces unseen with respect from colleagues. Lima, September 1800. Matteo held the compass with shaking hands, his eyes wet. He tried to speak, couldn't find words. Finally managed. "Thank you." It was the acknowledgement he'd ached into something undeniable. He began coughing blood. His fever spiked. The tremors in his hands intensified to where he could no longer draw fine details. The physician diagnosed advanced tuberculosis. In 1800, it was a death sentence. Slow, painful, and inevitable. Matteo was confined to his quarters for bed rest. The office sent food, medicine that did little. Visitors who didn't know what to say. Raphael came daily, reading aloud from books Matteo was too weak to hold. Don Vicente sent an urgent request to the viceroy. Grant early manumission on medical grounds. Let the man die free. The request entered the bureaucratic machine and ground slowly through administrative processes. Weeks passed. Matteo deteriorated. By early November, he was barely conscious most days. The physician said it was a matter of weeks. maybe days. Raphael sat beside him one lucid evening holding his friend's hand. "The manumission should come through soon," Raphael said, trying to sound confident. "Any day now." Matteo smiled weakly. "Bureaucracy moves at its own pace. You'll make it. Maybe, or maybe I'll die 3 days before freedom." "That would be appropriately tragic, wouldn't it?" "Don't." "I'm not bitter," Matteo said. And it seemed true. "I'm just tired. I've been tired for a very long time." He coughed. The sound wet and terrible. When he recovered, he said, "If I don't make it, I need you to promise me something." "Anything." "My personal map. The one I made in secret years ago. It's still in Lima, hidden in the quarters where I stayed at the general's residence under the floorboard's north corner. It has my signature. It's the first work I ever claimed as mine." Matteo described the map's location with precise geographical detail, even in his weakened state. "If you can find it, try to preserve it. Send it to Captain Graves if possible. Just let someone know I made it, that I signed it." "I'll find it," Raphael promised. "But you're going to survive to show me yourself." Matteo squeezed his hand weakly. "I navigated a lot of impossible spaces, but I'm not sure I can navigate this one." The Viceroy's approval for early manumission arrived on November 18, 1800. Matteo died on November 17. 24 hours separated him from the freedom he'd spent his entire life creating maps toward. He passed away in the early morning with Raphael beside him. His last conscious moments were spent holding the compass from the office ceremony, the needle pointing north, steady and true. Raphael closed his eyes with a grief that surprised him in its intensity. He'd known Matteo for less than 4 years, yet the loss felt enormous. The office held a small funeral. Don Vish spoke about Matteo's contributions to colonialography. A priest delivered brief remarks about eternal rest. Matteo was buried in Lima's common cemetery in a section designated for freed slaves and lower-class workers. A geography of death as stratified as the geography of life. His tombstone, paid for by office funds Raphael organized, read simply, "Matteo, Octographer 17751800. He mapped the world but traveled nowhere." It was the most official recognition he'd received while alive. Raphael didn't forget his promise. 3 weeks after the funeral, he went to the general's residence, now occupied by a different military officer, as Alvarez had been transferred to Madrid. He gained access by claiming to search for historical cartography department materials. He found the old quarters where Matteo had stayed years before, now used for storage. He found the north corner. He pried up floorboards, and he found the map. It was damaged. Water stains, torn edges, faded ink from years hidden in darkness. But it was intact enough to recognize a comprehensive map of South America, extraordinarily detailed with correction.